Hi, Jennifer here. I've got a new story for you today. It has got this protective parent vibe all the way through. It's about boundaries, respect, and choosing what really matters. Let's listen.
At Thanksgiving, my mother-in-law looked at my 18-year-old daughter and calmly said, "We all decided that you're no longer family." Then she was made to leave and spend Thanksgiving alone in her car. The next morning, the family lawyer called us in a panic because I got home late on Thanksgiving expecting the kind of quiet that feels earned. My husband Matt was working a holiday shift at the hospital, and our daughter Pamela had gone to his parents' house the way she usually did when he got pulled in. After the ugly dinner the week before, Teresa had called and said she did not want misunderstandings to ruin the holiday. Pamela thought maybe they had calmed down. I was not sure they had, but I also did not think they would do anything unforgivable with a holiday table already set. I even remember thinking she would probably sleep over there and come back after brunch the next day. I let myself into a dark kitchen with my purse sliding off my shoulder, already thinking about leftovers and whether I had the energy to wash my hair before bed. The house should have been empty except for the dog and the refrigerator humming. Instead, the porch light was still on. One lamp glowed in the living room, and Pamela's car was sitting in the driveway with a fast food cup on the dashboard. That stopped me before I even got my keys back into my bag. Pamela never came home early from Teresa and William's place on Thanksgiving, not unless somebody was sick or there had been a schedule change. I remember standing there with one hand on the door, still assuming there had to be some ordinary explanation. By then, the ordinary part was already over. Pamela was on the couch in her coat, sitting so still she looked like someone waiting to be called into an office. No TV, no music, no phone in her hand, which told me more than tears would have. Our daughter was 18 and usually full of movement even when she was tired. She tapped her foot, flipped her hair, scrolled something, made a snack, did anything at all. That night she was staring at the coffee table like it had been interesting for hours. I said her name once, then again, and she looked up too fast, like I had pulled her back from somewhere she did not want to be. "Hey," I said, dropping my keys into the bowl by the door. "I thought you were still at Grandma's." She shrugged in a tiny, stiff way and said, "I came home." Even her voice sounded flattened out, like the night had already happened to her, and I was arriving too late to stop any of it. I didn't sit in the chair across from her. I sat right beside her and kept my coat on. Something had gone wrong long before I walked through the door. I asked the wrong practical question first because my brain was still reaching for a normal answer. I knew things had already been tense since the dinner the week before, but I still reached for something smaller than the truth. "Did you and Grandma get into it?" I said. "Did your car break down?" Pamela shook her head. She rubbed both hands over her knees once and said, without drama, "I spent Thanksgiving in my car." For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard her. "What does that mean?" I asked. "Like after dinner? Before dinner? Did you leave because it got weird?" She looked at me the way people do when you are accidentally being too hopeful for them. "No, Mom," she said. "I mean, I spent Thanksgiving in my car." I started building bad explanations anyway. Maybe there had been some argument and she cooled off outside. Maybe she drove around to avoid coming home upset. Maybe they said something stupid and she decided to leave before it got worse. I asked if she had gotten stuck somewhere, if there had been a flat tire, if she had called anyone. She kept shaking her head. Then she took a breath and said very clearly, "I didn't get stuck anywhere." That was when I understood I had not even found the right question yet. When I finally asked, "Pamela, Did you leave or did somebody tell you to go? She looked me right in the face and said, "They kicked me out." My whole body went cold. She didn't rush it after that. She gave it to me piece by piece, almost like she had replayed it so many times the words were lined up now. Teresa, my mother-in-law, had waited until plates were on the table and then said they needed to be honest about what the pregnancy meant for the family. Pamela said she stood there while Teresa looked at her and calmly said, "We all decided that you're no longer family." William stood right there beside her. Teresa's older sister Denise was there too. Nobody interrupted. Nobody said that was too far. And nobody even acted shocked enough to make it seem like Teresa had gone off script. Pamela said she asked what that meant, and Teresa told her she should leave, not call them, and stop calling them grandparents because that chapter was over. "Did your grandfather say anything?" I asked. "Did anybody?" Pamela shook her head once. "No," she said. That was the worst part. Everybody just stood there like it made sense. I stopped hearing the room around us after that. Something in me had gone very still. I put my arm around her and pulled her into me, and the first thing I heard myself ask was, "Did you eat?" It sounded small and stupid in the air, but shock does that. It sends you toward the thing you can fix with your hands, because the real thing is too big to hold yet. Pamela nodded and said she got takeout. "From where?" I asked anyway. She named a little Chinese place near the highway and said she sat in the parking lot for a while, then drove to the grocery store lot because it felt less obvious, then ate in the car with the heat running. "I didn't want to come home right away," she said. "I didn't want to walk in here like that." I stood up, went to the kitchen, and found the white paper bag in the trash. Her receipt was on top, time-stamped in the middle of Thanksgiving evening. One untouched packet of soy sauce had fallen beside it. I heated water for tea even though neither of us wanted tea. The fact that she had eaten alone in a parked car made the whole thing physical. They had not just rejected her, they had sent her out into the holiday to figure out the rest by herself. For a while she kept talking the way people do when they are trying not to fall apart. Clean sentences, no tears, all facts. Then I said, "They're angry and cruel, but this is not the end of anything." And that was when her control slipped. She pressed both hands against her mouth, then dropped them and said, "I thought they'd be mad at me. I knew that part." Her voice shook on the next words. "I just didn't think they'd act like the baby was something disgusting." She stared at the floor and kept going before I could answer. She said she had honestly believed that once the shock wore off, maybe Teresa and William would calm down. Maybe they would still want to know the baby. Maybe they would at least see a baby as a baby, not a punishment. Instead, they had acted like being pregnant erased her place in the family completely. "It's not even just me anymore," she said. "They rejected my child too." That was the sentence that finally broke her open. She folded toward me and cried in a hard, quiet way that made me hold the back of her neck like she was still 6 years old. That was the moment I knew this would not be something we talked around and moved past. I told her what I could tell her with absolute certainty. I said she was our daughter, and nothing she had told me changed that. I said Matt would back her too, and if he had been in that house, none of this would have happened the way it did. Pamela nodded, but she looked worn out past words. I walked her upstairs, waited until she shut her bedroom door, and then stood in the hallway staring at the wood grain like it might explain anything. At that point, I still thought my in-laws were being rigid, cruel, and obsessed with appearances. I thought this was about shame, old rules, and the kind of family pride people use like furniture they inherited and never chose. I cleaned the kitchen for no reason, slept badly, and woke up with that flat feeling you get after a disaster that has not finished unfolding. At 8:14 the next morning, my phone lit up with a name I had not expected to see on the day after Thanksgiving. Mr. Whitaker, the family lawyer. Later we learned his office had been contacted early that morning after questions were suddenly raised about Harriet's trust and whether Pamela's pregnancy triggered anything in it. At the time, all I knew was that Teresa had not sounded offended the night before. She had sounded prepared. I stared at the screen before I answered, and for the first time it hit me that Teresa had not sounded offended last night. She had sounded prepared. A few weeks before Thanksgiving, Pamela found me alone in the kitchen after school while I was putting groceries away. She did not circle the subject or ask whether I had a minute. She stood by the counter in her hoodie, gripping the strap of her backpack so hard her knuckles blanched, and said, fast, "Mom, I'm pregnant." Then she looked at me the way people look when they have already imagined 5 different versions of your disappointment. Pamela was 18, finishing high school, accepted to a good college, and she had spent half her senior year talking about becoming a teacher. We had been comparing dorm photos and arguing about whether she needed a mini fridge. Now all of that seemed to move 2 feet to the left in one sentence. I told her to sit down, mostly because I needed both of us sitting. She didn't. She said she had taken 2 tests, then a third one because she thought the first 2 had to be wrong. She was already far enough along that denial had become impossible, which made the whole conversation feel less like a scare and more like a future arriving before any of us were ready. The kitchen clock was so loud I noticed it. I remember taking a carton of eggs out of the bag and setting it right back down because suddenly I could not trust myself to hold anything breakable. My next words mattered, and Pamela knew it. Once she sat, the rest came out in bursts. The baby's father was Tyler, her first real boyfriend, also 18, sweet in the way boys sometimes are before life asks them to be anything difficult. He was supposed to leave for college in another state by late summer. Pamela had been accepted somewhere else. There had never been some grand plan for them to get married young and build a life in matching sweatshirts. "I know the timing is awful," she kept saying. And every time she said it, I nodded because she was right. But every time she talked about the pregnancy itself, she talked about the baby like someone real already existed on the other side of all our fear. That mattered to me. She was scared, but she was not abstract about it. She said she didn't know exactly how she would do this, only that she did not want to pretend it was not happening. I was shaken. I was also her mother, so I did not lecture her, and I did not make her beg for help. I reached across the table, took her hand, and said, "We will figure out what comes next. You are not doing any of it alone." I watched her shoulders drop an inch, and that inch changed the whole room. Matt got home late that night, still wearing his work shoes, looking tired in the way only medical shifts can make a person look. I told Pamela I would tell him myself, so she would not have to relive the first hard moment twice in one day. He had barely set down his bag when I said we needed to talk. He saw my face and stopped trying to unbutton his coat. I told him plainly that Pamela was pregnant, that she had told me that afternoon, and that she was terrified of what he might say. He did not speak for about 3 seconds, which felt longer. Then he asked, "Is she okay?" Not, "How could this happen?" Not, "What was she thinking?" He asked if she was okay, whether she had seen a doctor yet, and whether she needed anything right away. When I told him she was upstairs and bracing for the worst, he went halfway up, then stopped and asked me, "Do you want me to go in, or does she need a minute?" That question almost made me cry. When Pamela finally came down, he hugged her first. I watched her face change in real time, fear loosening into something survivable. That was when we became a team instead of a crisis. About a week before Thanksgiving, Pamela and I had dinner at Teresa and William's house because they wanted to talk as a family. Matt was stuck at the hospital that night, and Teresa had acted as if waiting for him would only drag things out, which should have told me exactly what kind of evening she intended to have. Even before dessert, I could tell that phrase had been used as a trap. Their dining room always looked like a staged model home, candles lit, polished silver, everything arranged like good manners could substitute for warmth. Teresa kept her voice low at first, which somehow made it worse. She said she was deeply disappointed. William talked about choices and consequences in that legal, careful tone he used whenever he wanted cruelty to sound rational. Pamela listened with both hands in her lap and her jaw set tight. Then Teresa brought up Harriet, Matt's late grandmother, the woman who built most of the family money from a handful of properties and a level of stubbornness everybody else had turned into legend. "Harriet would have been ashamed," Teresa said, and she said it with satisfaction, as if she were reaching for the one name nobody was allowed to argue with. William followed her with talk about the family name, standards, and how some behavior was not supposed to be rewarded. I watched Pamela go from nervous to angry in one slow, visible shift. The evening had stopped pretending to be a discussion. The real point surfaced when Teresa and William moved from shame to money. Teresa said no one should assume that family support continued no matter what somebody chose to do. William said it more smoothly, as if he were explaining a policy. If Pamela insisted on keeping the baby, she should not count on being treated the same way when Harriet's estate was considered in the future. Pamela looked from one to the other and said, "What exactly are you threatening me with?" Teresa answered with words like values, legacy, and consequences, never once saying inheritance directly again because she knew she already had. William added that Harriet had created what she created for people who honored the family, not embarrassed it. That did it. Pamela sat up straight and said, very clearly, "You are not going to use money to make me ashamed of my own baby." I said, "And you are not going to talk to her like this while pretending it's guidance." The room went flat after that. Teresa told us we were being emotional. William said we would all regret making this adversarial. No one raised a voice. Nobody had to. By the time we left, the line had already been drawn, and everybody at that table knew it. When Mr. Whitaker called the morning after Thanksgiving, he did not start with condolences or explanation. He asked one question first. "Courtney," he said, "before I say anything else, I need to confirm whether Pamela is pregnant." His tone was careful in a way that made my stomach drop. I said yes, she was, and then I asked why he needed to know that. There was a small pause, paper moving on his end, and then he said it concerned provisions in Harriet's trust. Harriet was Matt's late grandmother, Pamela's great-grandmother, and by then I thought I knew exactly what that meant. Teresa and William had spent the last week wrapping shame and money around the same threat. Now the family lawyer was calling the morning after Thanksgiving to ask if the pregnancy was real. "Are they trying to cut her out?" I asked. He did not answer that directly. He said only that he needed to meet with us as soon as possible and would prefer to do it that afternoon or the next morning at the latest. He gave me a time, repeated the office address we knew, and said, "Please bring Pamela." After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand and felt sure we were walking into a formal version of the same rejection. Matt had gotten home and slept only a few hours when I told him everything at once. The lawyer's call, the trust, and exactly what his parents had done on Thanksgiving. I told him Teresa said our daughter was no longer family. William stood there, and they sent a pregnant girl out of the house to spend the holiday in her car. Matt sat on the edge of the bed, awake in a way I had not seen in years. "They did what?" he said, and I repeated it because I needed those words to belong to them, not to rumor. He picked up his phone before I finished. Teresa answered, and I heard him say, "If you can decide my daughter isn't family, then don't expect me to keep treating you like family either." She must have tried to turn it on him, because his face changed from fury to something colder. "Ashamed?" he said. "You threw your granddaughter out on Thanksgiving." William got on the line and started talking about lessons, standards, and enabling bad choices. Matt cut him off. "You don't get to call cruelty a lesson," he said. By the time he ended the call, there was nothing soft left in him. We went into Mr. Whitaker's office the way people walk into an appointment they already think they understand. Pamela sat between Matt and me in the waiting room with her hands locked together so tightly her thumbs went white. Mr. Whitaker, the family lawyer, came out himself and ushered us into the conference room with a file box already open on the table. He was older, formal, and not a man given to wasted motion. That morning he seemed unsettled anyway. He sat down, opened a folder, and said that before he explained anything about the trust, there was an item Harriet had directed to be delivered under very specific circumstances. Then he reached into the folder and handed Pamela a sealed envelope with Harriet's name written in a sharp, slanting hand across the front. Pamela looked at me, then at Matt, then broke the seal with one finger under the flap. I braced myself for something dry and cruel, one more message from the dead being used to control the living. Instead, as Pamela's eyes moved down the page, her whole face changed. She blinked once, looked back at the top as if checking she had read it right, and then handed the letter to Matt without saying a word. The room had turned, and none of us knew by how much. Harriet's letter was nothing like the version of her Teresa had used as a weapon. She wrote plainly, almost bluntly, that she had once been a very young woman carrying a child before she had security, before respectability, before the family liked to remember her story. She wrote that the hardest years of her life were exactly the years later generations polished away. One sentence made Pamela put her hand over her mouth. No girl in my line is ever to be cornered, shamed, or abandoned for carrying a child. Harriet said fear passes, gossip passes, and people who love rules more than people always claim they are protecting the family when really they are protecting their comfort. She said a baby is never a stain, and no one should be made to trade dignity for support. By the time Matt finished reading, there was not a single sentence in that letter that sounded anything like Teresa's warnings about legacy and standards. Pamela sat very still while tears ran down her face, not because the words were sentimental, but because they were practical and fierce in exactly the place she had been wounded. The woman they had invoked like a threat had built a door where they had tried to build a wall. Only after the letter did Mr. Whitaker explain the legal part, and it was so different from what we had feared that I had to make him repeat himself. Harriet's trust did not punish pregnancy. It protected against abandonment during pregnancy. There was a provision, he said, to activate support if a direct female descendant became pregnant young and chose to carry the child. Harriet had written it specifically to prevent exactly the kind of isolation, panic, and financial pressure Pamela was now facing. That support included funds and housing security on top of anything Pamela was entitled to receive. Pamela laughed once in disbelief, then apologized because it sounded impossible after the way Teresa and William had spoken. Mr. Whitaker did not look offended. He looked grim. He said Harriet had been explicit that money was not to be used as leverage against a young mother in the family. "The clause exists to make sure she does not struggle alone," he said. Pamela stared at him, then at the letter again. "So they knew?" she asked. "They knew this and told me the opposite?" Mr. Whitaker chose his words carefully and said he could not yet speak to what they knew or when they knew it. But the fact sat in the room anyway. Everything Teresa and William had framed as consequence might actually have been protection, and they had tried to weaponize the lie before we ever saw the paperwork. Then the meeting shifted again. Mr. Whitaker referred to the pregnancy support as being in addition to Pamela's regular distributions, and Pamela interrupted him with a confused frown. "What regular distributions?" she asked. He looked up from the file and said, "The distributions you began receiving at 18. She shook her head. "I never got anything." He seemed to think Matt and I had handled the money for her. We told him no. He flipped pages, asked whether checks had been sent elsewhere, whether there was an account in her name, and whether any educational payments had been made on her behalf. Up to that point, he said, the trustee's office had been certifying that routine distributions were being handled appropriately. Pamela's pregnancy had forced him to review the file more closely, and for the first time the paperwork and reality were no longer matching. Pamela answered no to all of it. According to the trust, funds should already have been distributed to her when she turned 18, and there appeared to be earlier educational support due before that. None of it had reached her. Mr. Whitaker took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and said he would have to investigate immediately. "Please understand," he said, "if what you are telling me is accurate, this is not a misunderstanding." We walked out of that office with one fear removed and a worse one settling into place. Teresa and William had not been defending Harriet's values. They may have been hiding money that was never theirs to control. The days after that first meeting moved faster than any family conflict I had ever seen, because once Mr. Whitaker stopped dealing in broad warnings and started dealing in records, everything changed shape. He called for past distributions, rental income statements, trustee decisions, expense logs, property management documents, and any communication tied to Pamela's share of Harriet's trust. He asked dates, signatures, account numbers. He sent short emails that sounded polite until you realized every sentence required an answer somebody might not want to give. For the first time, Teresa and William were not standing in a dining room speaking for the family. They were being asked to account for paperwork. That mattered. Moral superiority can survive almost anything. Missing transfers and unsigned authorizations cannot. Matt read each update with his jaw locked. Pamela kept asking whether she had somehow missed something obvious, whether a letter had gone to the wrong address, whether there was some innocent explanation. There could have been, in theory, but innocence does not usually require this much backtracking. By the third day, even Mr. Whitaker's voice had changed. He was no longer asking us to be patient while he clarified confusion. He was asking for patience while he verified what had already started to look very bad. Teresa and William came to our house 2 evenings later without calling first. I saw their sedan pull into the driveway and knew at once this was not a visit about reconciliation. Teresa stepped onto the porch already talking, pearls on, coat buttoned, as if formal clothes could make what they wanted seem reasonable. William stood beside her with that practiced look of injured authority. I did not invite them in right away, but they kept pressing, so Matt opened the door and let them stand just inside the entry. Teresa said the situation was getting out of hand, that lawyers were making everything uglier than it needed to be, and that families should handle family matters privately. William said Mr. Whitaker had overreacted to a simple misunderstanding. Then, because greed eventually makes people careless, they said the quiet part out loud. Teresa complained that it was absurd for Pamela to receive extra support just because she got pregnant. And in that moment, the moral argument finally dropped its mask. This was not about standards. It was about money they had already started treating as their own. William talked about properties being tied up, obligations to other branches of the family, rental income already allocated, plans already made. He said it as if Harriet's trust were a household budget they had kindly been stretching for everyone's benefit. Pamela was upstairs and could probably hear every word through the floorboards. That was when their motive stopped pretending to be principle. Matt did not yell. That would have given them something easy to dismiss. He stood in our foyer with one hand on the open door and answered them in the calmest voice I had heard from him all week. He said, "You did not treat my daughter like family when you threw her out on Thanksgiving and left her alone in her car, so you do not get to hide behind family now that paperwork is involved." Teresa tried the softer approach first, saying everyone had been emotional, that maybe words were chosen poorly, that Pamela had misunderstood. Matt did not move. "She understood perfectly," he said. William hardened again and said this was exactly what was wrong now. No consequences, no standards, no respect for the people who built anything. Matt looked at him and said, "What Harriet built is why this conversation is happening, and you've used her name to do the opposite of what she wanted." Then he made the line final. He told them we were not dropping anything because they had lied to our daughter, humiliated her, and tried to pressure her with money that was never theirs to weaponize. "After this," he said, "there are no more calls, no more visits, and no more pretending." He held the door wider, and they had to walk through it. At the follow-up meeting, Mr. Whitaker had numbers instead of suspicions. He laid them out one by one across the conference table, while Pamela listened with both hands flat on her knees, as if holding herself steady. Harriet's trust required a $25,000 distribution to Pamela at 18. It had not been paid. There was also $12,000 in earlier educational support that should have been used on her behalf over the years and had never been properly distributed. On top of that, Harriet's pregnancy clause now released another $85,000 in protected support to be paid in stages for Pamela and the baby. Then came the piece that explained why Teresa and William had fought so hard against the pregnancy becoming real in the paperwork. Harriet had designated one of the trust's rental properties to be made available to a young mother in exactly Pamela's position. Not eventually. Now. Once activated, the housing provision shifted control of that property away from discretionary management and toward Pamela's direct use. William had been collecting rent on that place. Teresa had been treating the arrangement like permanent family income. Suddenly, their objections about values made brutal financial sense. They were never defending legacy. They were defending control. The enforcement part took weeks, but it did happen, and I think that matters when people tell stories like this. Life rarely flips in one dramatic hour. It turns because paperwork keeps moving after the dramatic hour is over. Mr. Whitaker confirmed that Teresa and William were removed from key control as trustees once the records showed they had mishandled the trust and failed to make required distributions. They were ordered to account for what had been withheld and repay what could be traced. He told us they were personally liable to return the missing $37,000 that should have reached Pamela, and the trust would also recover rental income they had no right to keep once the property was reassigned under Harriet's housing provision. Pamela received the missed distributions, the newly triggered support, and access to the rental house Harriet had set aside decades earlier for a girl exactly like her. That was the deepest part of it for me. The family story used to shame her turned out to have been built to protect her all along. Matt followed through on everything he said in the foyer. He blocked their numbers, stopped answering messages, and went fully no contact. They had tried to keep power by closing a door on our daughter. Instead, they lost every door they had mistaken for ownership. A few months later, the house Harriet had set aside no longer felt like a legal outcome. It felt like Pamela's place. There was a bassinet in the corner of the bedroom, folded laundry on the sofa, and a whiteboard on the fridge with feeding times, pediatric appointments, and a list of classes she wanted to take once the baby settled into more predictable sleep. Our grandson arrived healthy and uninterested in the family mythology that had nearly swallowed his mother whole. Pamela was tired. She was steadier than I had seen since that kitchen conversation. Tyler was not her partner anymore, but he showed up, learned, and did the awkward work of becoming a young father instead of disappearing. With the support finally in place, Pamela could breathe long enough to plan again. Becoming a teacher was not gone. It had just taken a different road. Teresa and William lost the control they were desperate to protect, and Harriet's wishes won without anybody needing to scream, so I still wonder what other people think. Did we do the right thing by forcing the trust to follow Harriet's wishes and cutting them off when they lied, or were they right that bad choices should have consequences? Tell me in the comments and subscribe for more.